the more likely outcome, given the pressure arising from the terrible toll on Palestinian civilians and the pressure on the Israeli government from the families of their own hostages, means that another round of temporary ceasefire, which is built around a hostage exchange, is more likely than any sense of there being a ceasefire where the fighting stops, because Israel would know very well it got nowhere near accomplishing its core objective, which has driven this from the outset of trying to destroy Hamas as a military force. If they have a ceasefire now, Hamas isn't even half destroyed. And that you can see that they will resist that.
The White House has said very serious negotiations are underway with Hamas in Egypt. The terror group have said they're not prepared to discuss the release of any more hostages until the violence stops. However, the Israeli Defense Forces are maintaining the intensity of their military operation in Gaza, with over 230 targets struck in the past 24 hours. Meanwhile, Houthi rebels have vowed to attack American container ships as they make their way to Europe through the Red Sea. My next guest knows all about negotiations with hostile terrorists after his time serving in Afghanistan. Please welcome Sir Richard Barrons, former commander of the Joint Forces Command. Thanks for being with us, Sir Richard. Hugely appreciate your time. In this situation, it feels like Hamas and negotiators, the White House, are at loggerheads. Is there anything that can be done, or what is the process that might be used here when some common ground is basically sought between the groups of negotiators, between the groups of people?
So I think the first point is it's quite common in these situations to fight on the one hand and talk on the other, and most wars and battles aren't ever really fought to a successful conclusion. They culminate or run out of steam, and talking can take over. But in the case in Gaza, the position I think is that the Israeli military don't think they're even halfway through the operation that they're conducting to try and destroy Hamas, which they know that they can't achieve comprehensively. And they're then now beginning to think about how they then hold on to bits of Gaza that they've fought over so far, and what then happens. This is a long way to go. And Hamas, from its perspective, it would love to find a way in which the Israeli Defense Forces were made to stop now, because more of them would survive, and Hamas would regain strength, I think, in time quite quickly. But both of those things seem to be pretty unlikely.
As we've said, the sort of tempo of the IDF and of the military operation in Gaza doesn't seem to have eased at all. There was speculation that it might do so after the pause last week, but they continue really at the same pace. Hamas has also conducted a series of rocket attacks against Tel Aviv earlier today as well. So there is still action on both sides. In terms of the ground operation, is it a holding operation right now, or what is your perspective on what the next sort of 2 to 5 days might hold?
So it is different in the north of Gaza, where the Israeli military think they have pretty much destroyed the Hamas's northern brigade, the Hamas fighters who operated in that part of Gaza. And the IDF, are beginning to transition now from the offensive operations to break into Gaza to an operation where they keep control of it while somebody works out what happens next. And that's a really big question. In the south, of course, that control doesn't exist. And we are still seeing, as you described, well over 200 strikes during the course of today as the Israeli military bear down on Hamas in the south of Gaza, with all the consequences we're seeing of concentrated civilian population in and amongst the fighting. So that the war doesn't feel like it's very different yet from anything we've seen over the last few weeks, and I don't think that's really going to change for some time, some weeks even, unless Israel is prevailed upon to stop, which it's not minded to do, and that might be linked to a hostage deal, but that looks pretty difficult still.
The conflict risks spilling out across the region. This has been a threat since war broke out. The King of Jordan's push for an immediate ceasefire as part of a visit from the French President Emmanuel Macron. How much weight do the international community have? How much pressure can they put on either side?
So I think Israel only listens to the United States. I think there is a general consensus in the region and the world, more broadly, that an escalation of this war beyond Israel is to no one's advantage. Iran, for example, is keen to see the US diminished and Israel destroyed in due course if it could. But it doesn't want that to be at the price of a war between Iran and the US. So its proxies, the Houthis in Yemen, in a calibrated way, are one way of putting more pressure on Israel and the US. And the acid test that we are living with now, I think day by day, is at the minute that the Houthis will fire rockets at US and other ships in the Red Sea and at Israel. And the US military and other militaries try to shoot those rockets and drones down. What no one is doing so far is striking where those rockets come from in Yemen. That would be a major step, and that would be seen by many as really difficult escalation. And I sense everyone is trying to avoid that.
Do you think it's likely? What does your gut tell you on this in terms of sort of how this escalated? Is it dictated by what the Houthi rebels do next in terms of will they keep up their assault in the Red Sea?
So I think if the Houthi attacks on ships escalated, or perhaps there was a significant success, sinking a large vessel, the chances of being struck in Yemen will rise. But the escalation risk is partly about what happens between the Red Sea and the Houthis, and much about what happens between Israel and Hezbollah in the north of Israel, and perhaps in the West Bank, where there's some very difficult relationships between Israeli settlers and the Palestinian citizens who sit on that land. So we've always had to live with the thought that if badly handled, this war could escalate in a number of ways, and no one can be completely confident they can manage or control that risk. And it's always worth thinking about that most wars, when they start, they very quickly spiral out of the control of any one party, and you end up where you end up. And nobody wants that in this situation.
Yeah. Now, speaking of the US, there are negotiations going on still. We're still waiting for news about when and if the UN Security Council will vote today on a new ceasefire resolution. Certainly the wording is geared now towards getting aid into Gaza and sort of perhaps more of a temporary pause than anything, than a more sort of weighty ceasefire. But negotiations are still going on, and I just wonder what your perspective is on that. If the resolution goes ahead, what kind of effect, if any, will that have?
So I think that the more likely outcome, given the pressure arising from the terrible toll on Palestinian civilians and the pressure on the Israeli government from the families of their own hostages, means that another round of temporary ceasefire, which is built around a hostage exchange, is more likely than any sense of there being a ceasefire where the fighting stops, because Israel would know very well it got nowhere near accomplishing its core objective, which has driven this from the outset of trying to destroy Hamas as a military force. If they have a ceasefire now, Hamas isn't even half destroyed. And that you can see that they will resist that.
Thank you so much for speaking to us, Sir Richard Barrons, former commander of the Joint Forces Command. Thank you for your time here with us on Times Radio tonight. Thank you.